The hum of the airplane was steady, almost soothing, that low vibration beneath the floor that made people close their eyes and forget they were thousands of feet above the world. But in seat 2A, that comfort was about to shatter. Three young boys sat side by side, identical faces framed by neatly trimmed hair, the matching brown jackets marking them as triplets, something that usually drew smiles and small talk from strangers. But this time the smiles were missing. Their trays sat empty, their wide eyes watching as the flight attendant leaned over them with a smile that wasn't really a smile at all. Her white-gloved hand hovered near the tray, and her voice, though soft, carried an edge that cut through the cabin. She said they would have to share one meal. That first class didn't accommodate duplicates. For a moment, there was only silence. A strange kind of silence, the kind that hums with disbelief. Passengers turned, curious but hesitant, and the three boys, unsure of what was happening, looked around for their mother. She wasn't far, a few rows back, on a call she delayed for days. She was a woman who carried calm like armor, poised, confident, and too used to pretending not to notice the quiet judgments that followed her success. She'd fought too long to let anything disturb her peace. But peace is fragile, especially when it involves your children. The sound that broke it was small, a trembling voice, polite and unsure, asking why they couldn't each have their own meal like everyone else. The flight attendant's tone changed. It sharpened, wrapped in condescension disguised as control, and when one of the boys flinched at her words, she leaned closer, her polished white sleeve brushing the edge of his tray, and said something that made an entire row of passengers inhale at once. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the venom in it was unmistakable. "I said you'll share. Be grateful for that." The smallest boy blinked, his lip trembling, his hand gripping the armrest. Across the aisle, someone shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down, pretending not to see. The kind of silence that follows racism is heavy, not because it's rare, but because it's familiar. And then, the moment that changed everything, the flight attendant leaned closer, her expression hard, and hissed words that shouldn't exist in any sky. Her hand lifted slightly, threateningly. That was when the world seemed to stop. The boy didn't cry, but his brothers looked away, their faces pale with confusion. Around them, people froze, not sure whether to speak, to act, or to stay hidden in the safety of their silence. But one person didn't stay still. A calm voice rose from the aisle behind them. Not loud, not angry, just steady, the kind that carries command even without trying. The mother was standing now. Her blue suit caught the light like a flash of storm against sky, and in her eyes, calm, unwavering, was a look that could silence 1,000 storms. The passengers watched, waiting. The air was electric, charged with something bigger than the single confrontation. No one knew yet that what was about to unfold would ripple far beyond that cabin, that a single moment of quiet defiance would unravel an airline's image, challenge its polished face of professionalism, and ignite a conversation the world had been too afraid to have. Because this wasn't just about a meal. It was about dignity, and the people who still believed they could deny it. And before the plane even landed, the world would know exactly who this mother was. The morning had started like any other, but with a kind of calm that felt earned. Outside her penthouse window, the city was still half asleep, lights winking beneath a pale sky that promised another busy day. Vanessa Hart stood in her kitchen, the glow from the marble counters reflecting against her blue suit. It was sharp, structured, the kind of suit that said I've earned my place in every room I walk into. She sipped her coffee slowly, staring at her reflection in the glass. There was something almost sacred about mornings like this, the stillness before the world's noise caught up. But even as she stood in silence, her phone buzzed with reminders. Board meeting at noon, investor call by 3, and the flight she was taking with her boys in just 2 hours. It wasn't a business trip this time. It was supposed to be a break, a rare gift she'd promised them after months of late nights and long absences. The twins, no triplets, she corrected herself with a soft smile, were her world. Joshua, Jaden, and Jordan, each with the same bright eyes but entirely different souls. Joshua, the quiet one, Jaden, the dreamer, and Jordan, the one who always asked why. They were 10 now, and somehow, despite her schedule, she hadn't missed the way they looked at her, with that mix of pride and longing kids reserved for parents who seem larger than life, but just as far away. Today, she was determined to change that. The flight was meant to be a gesture of love, first class, the best she could give, not for luxury's sake, but for symbolism. To her, those seats represented everything she'd fought for: dignity, comfort, equality. Every inch of that cabin felt like a small rebellion against the people who once told her she'd never belong there. She had been one of those statistics once, a single black mother, raising 3 boys alone after her husband died in an accident that made headlines for a week and then disappeared into silence. She remembered standing in hospital hallways, holding her sons close, making a promise through tears: they will never see us small again. And she had kept that promise. By 38, Vanessa was the CEO of a tech firm that had redefined accessibility software. Her name had been on magazine covers, her speeches at conferences quoted for their clarity and fire. She had become something of a symbol, a face of black excellence that the corporate world was happy to parade around when it made them look progressive. But beneath the polished veneer of equality, she'd learned how fragile it all was, how quickly admiration could turn to discomfort when she stopped playing the role of gratitude. That morning, she tucked that thought away, choosing instead to focus on the day ahead. The boys were laughing in the living room, trying to cram their stuffed animals into sleek travel bags. She paused at the doorway, smiling. For a moment, she saw what she'd always wanted for them: innocence untouched by the world's cruelty. "All right, my little men," she said, grabbing her bag. "Let's make this trip one to remember." They didn't know yet how true those words would be. The airport was its usual blur of movement and sound: the click of shoes on polished floors, the low murmur of boarding announcements, the tired buzz of travelers chasing time zones. Vanessa walked through it all with the kind of effortless grace that turned heads. Her sons trailed behind her, perfectly in sync, dressed in their matching brown jackets. She caught the glances, the double takes, the subtle smiles, but also the other kind, the ones that lingered a little too long, puzzled that a woman like her, elegant, self-assured, and unmistakably black, moved with such authority in a space that still subconsciously coded wealth as white. She had learned to read those looks long ago. She'd stopped caring about them, at least, she told herself she had. At the gate, a young attendant scanned her tickets and blinked twice when she saw the class printed on them. Vanessa noticed. She always noticed. "First class," the attendant said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You and your boys." "Yes," Vanessa replied evenly. "All 4 of us." There was a tiny pause, just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then the attendant nodded, gesturing them through. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." It was the kind of interaction that barely registered for most people, but for Vanessa, it was another notch in a long history of subtle barriers, the micro-moments that collectively screamed what no one dared to say out loud: "You don't belong here." Still, she smiled, ushering her boys forward. "Remember, gentlemen," she said softly, "we walk like we're already where we're supposed to be." Inside the plane, the world looked different. First class was a small kingdom of calm, wide seats, dimmed lights, and that faint scent of leather and money. The triplets' eyes went wide as they climbed into their seats, their excitement unfiltered. "Mom," Jordan whispered, touching the screen in front of him. "It's like a spaceship." Vanessa laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "A very expensive spaceship," she said, buckling him in. For the first time in months, she felt her shoulders relax. The tension that had become second nature to her, the quiet readiness to defend, to prove, to correct, seemed to dissolve in the hum of the engines. But that peace didn't last. It began with something small: a hesitation, a look. The flight attendant assigned to their section, a woman in her 40s, with a tight bun and a smile that felt rehearsed, approached with trays of sparkling water. Her eyes flicked over Vanessa, then to the boys, and her expression faltered. "Good afternoon," she said. "Are these your children?" Vanessa smiled, unaware of the undertone yet. "They are. Joshua, Jaden, and Jordan." The attendant's lips curved, but the smile was brittle. "Triplets," she murmured. "How interesting." She set the glasses down a little too carefully, her eyes lingering on the boy's brown skin against the white leather seats. And then she said it, soft enough to sound like a joke, but sharp enough to wound. "I guess this is a first, 3 of them up here." Vanessa froze. She didn't respond immediately. Years of boardrooms and bias had taught her restraint, how to let words fall without giving them power. So she just looked at the woman, steady and polite, as if daring her to say more. But the attendant didn't need to. The seed had been planted. In that single sentence was a lifetime of coded meaning. You don't belong here. You're out of place. Be grateful for what you've been allowed. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her nails pressing lightly into her palm. She smiled, not for the woman, but for her sons, who were watching her closely, sensing something shift. She wasn't going to let this woman ruin their moment. Or so she thought. By the time the plane leveled out, the mood had changed. The boys were laughing softly, taking turns exploring their seat controls, and Vanessa was flipping through a presentation draft on her tablet. The attendant had passed by twice, once with drinks, once with a glance that lingered too long. And then came the moment. Dinner service. Vanessa had chosen the same meal for all 3 boys, roasted chicken with pasta, something simple and safe. But when the attendant returned, her tray held only one. Vanessa frowned, certain it was a mistake. But the woman's voice, sweet but strained, explained it away. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "We're short on first-class meals tonight. Your children can share one for now. We'll see if anything's left from business class later." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Vanessa blinked, processing the absurdity. "Excuse me." But before she could continue, the attendant smiled that same professional smile, the kind that shut down arguments without ever seeming rude. "We'll make it work," she said. "They look like they can share." Vanessa's pulse quickened. She looked at her sons, 3 boys sitting upright now, uncertain, confused, their joy dimming. She looked around the cabin. Every other child, every other passenger had their own tray. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. And in that quiet, elegant space 30,000 feet above the ground, Vanessa Hart felt the familiar ache of injustice return, sharp and unmistakable. But this time, she wouldn't swallow it. Because this wasn't just another meeting or a microaggression she could overlook. This was about her children. And that meant the rules were about to change. At first, Vanessa tried to tell herself it wasn't worth it, that it was just one meal on one flight. But the moment she saw the expression on her sons' faces, the confusion, the embarrassment, the way they glanced at each other instead of at her, she knew this was more than that. It wasn't about food. It was about humiliation disguised as policy. The flight attendant's words, "They can share," echoed in her mind like a blade scraping metal. Vanessa took a slow breath, her hand steady on her lap. Years of navigating white-dominated boardrooms had trained her to hold her tone, to wear calm like armor. But her heartbeat told another story. It pounded against her ribs, each thud spelling out not again. Joshua was the first to whisper. "Mom, it's okay," he said softly, his voice careful, protective in the way oldest children sometimes are. "We're not that hungry." Vanessa turned to him. Her eyes really, were trying to be brave. That alone nearly broke her. Jaden sat quietly, staring at the tray in front of them, his lips pressed tight. Jordan fidgeted with his napkin, trying not to cry. He was always the sensitive one, the one who still asked her, "Why do people look at us funny sometimes?" Her throat tightened. "Sweetheart," she said gently, her voice calm, too calm. "You don't have to say that. You deserve your own meal. All of you do." But as she spoke, the flight attendant was already moving on, smiling easily at a couple across the aisle, refilling their champagne flutes, pretending she hadn't just reduced 3 children to one tray between them. Vanessa felt something dark and familiar rising, a heat that wasn't anger yet, but something deeper. Something she'd spent years learning how to manage. She had endured microaggressions in meetings, patronizing compliments from men who'd told her she was articulate for someone like you. She had built an empire on self-control, but in this narrow aisle, surrounded by soft lighting and polite laughter, she felt the old indignity rear its head like a ghost she thought she'd buried. Because here, in the luxury she had paid for, the message was the same as it had always been. You don't belong here, no matter how much you've earned it. She pressed the call button. It wasn't a gesture of confrontation, not yet. It was procedural, rational, a chance to correct a mistake. The attendant returned a minute later, her professional smile already reassembled. Yes, ma'am. Vanessa gestured toward the tray. You said you were short on meals. I'd like to understand what that means. Are you out of stock entirely, or just for my children? The woman blinked. There it was, the flicker of defensiveness, quick and instinctive. Ma'am, we've had some last-minute substitutions. We have a full cabin, and we're prioritizing based on what's been pre-ordered. I pre-ordered 3 children's meals when I booked these tickets, Vanessa said evenly. The attendant's smile tightened. I understand that, but unfortunately, those requests are not always guaranteed. Vanessa tilted her head. And yet every other child in this cabin has one. The woman hesitated. Ma'am, we're doing our best. Perhaps they can share for now. And once we check the business class leftovers, we'll... Leftovers. The word was soft, but it sliced through the air. Passengers around them had started to notice the shift in tone. Heads turned slightly, just enough to catch fragments of conversation without seeming nosy. The attendant's posture stiffened. Ma'am, please lower your voice. Vanessa did the opposite. She didn't raise her volume, but she let her composure grow colder, heavier. I am perfectly calm, she said. But what I will not do is allow my children to be treated as though they should be grateful for scraps when they have paid for the same service as everyone else in this cabin. The attendant took a step back, her cheeks coloring. I assure you, there's no discrimination here, ma'am. And there it was, the most predictable line in the book. No discrimination. Just coincidence. Just circumstance. Just a mistake. Vanessa looked at her sons again. 3 brown faces turned quietly toward her, trying to read her reaction, waiting for permission to feel. Something inside her clicked. No, she said softly. There is discrimination here. You just don't have to call it that, because the system already excuses you for it. The attendant's eyes flashed, not with guilt, but offense. Ma'am, if you continue to make a scene. Vanessa's laugh was quiet and disbelieving. A scene, she repeated. You think standing up for my children's dignity is a scene? But before the woman could answer, another voice interrupted. A man in a crisp gray suit. 2 rows back. Hey, he said, leaning forward. She's right. You can't serve 1 meal to 3 kids. That's ridiculous. And just like that, the cabin's quiet politeness fractured. Murmurs rippled through the seats, not loud, but noticeable. The attendant's face tightened further. For a moment, Vanessa thought she saw something unguarded, fear maybe. Not for what she'd done, but for the possibility of being called out publicly. She mumbled something about checking again and turned away. Vanessa leaned back, her pulse still high. Joshua glanced up at her. Mom, he whispered. Did we do something wrong? The question lodged itself in her chest. She placed a hand on his knee, steady and firm. Never think that, baby, she said. Never. 10 minutes passed. The hum of the plane returned to its steady rhythm. The attendant didn't come back. Instead, another one appeared, younger, nervous, her smile more genuine but unsure. Ma'am, she said softly, I wanted to apologize. We do have extra meals available. They'll be brought out shortly. Vanessa nodded. Thank you. The girl hesitated. And I'm sorry for how my colleague spoke to you earlier. That wasn't right. For a moment, Vanessa saw something human there, the awareness that not everyone in that uniform shared the same prejudice. She smiled faintly, grateful. It's not your fault, she said, but thank you for saying it. Still, as the girl walked away, Vanessa felt the tension in her shoulders refuse to ease. because apologies didn't erase humiliation, not when it had been witnessed. Her sons were quiet now. Their earlier joy had dimmed, replaced by something more complicated. Jaden finally spoke, his voice small. "Mom, why did she do that?" Vanessa didn't answer immediately. The truth was too heavy, too unfair to hand to a 10-year-old. So she took a breath and said, "Sometimes people make judgments before they know your story. But what matters is that you never let them decide your worth." They nodded, each processing it differently. Joshua stared at the window, Jaden at the tray. Jordan reached for her hand and held it. The moment felt fragile, as if something invisible had cracked between them, a piece of innocence quietly stolen. When the meals finally arrived, they came with a new layer of performance. The senior attendant returned, this time with a forced warmth, her tone syrupy and exaggerated. "Here we are," she said, setting down 3 plates as though she were bestowing a favor. "We were able to find enough after all." Vanessa didn't look up. She simply said, "As you should have." The woman froze mid-motion, then set the last tray down and stepped back. Vanessa didn't bother with eye contact. Her energy had shifted from defensive to deliberate, because this wasn't about one act of bias anymore. This was about a system so confident in its prejudice that it assumed it could hide behind politeness. And Vanessa Hart had built her career dismantling systems exactly like that. Hours passed. The flight continued smoothly on the surface. Dinner cleared, lights dimmed, passengers lulled into the quiet monotony of altitude. But Vanessa's mind refused to rest. She kept replaying it. The tone, the glance, the dismissive assurance that it wasn't about race. She had been in this position before, not on a plane, but in conference rooms, schools, interviews, fundraisers. Always the same performance of grace under silent insult. Always the same balance between fury and diplomacy. But this time was different because her children had seen it. She couldn't shield them from it anymore. She had spent their whole lives teaching them to hold their heads high, to believe in fairness, to trust that the world was changing. Yet here they were, watching their mother, a CEO, a woman of status and strength, treated as though her money was borrowed and her presence conditional. Something inside her hardened. She opened her laptop and began typing, not for work, but for evidence, timestamps, descriptions, every detail of the exchange. Not because she wanted to complain, but because she understood systems only changed when proof was undeniable. Her fingers moved with precision. Every sentence felt like a strike, clean, calm, irrefutable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was methodical. When the attendant passed again, Vanessa looked up, her expression calm. "Could you please provide me your full name?" The woman blinked. "Excuse me." "For documentation," Vanessa said, her tone even. "You will be included in my report." Passengers stirred slightly, a ripple of awareness. The attendant's composure wavered. "Ma'am, I don't think that's necessary." "It is," Vanessa said, "because this isn't just about food. It's about conduct." Her voice wasn't angry. It was controlled, precise. The voice of someone who'd spent a lifetime having to prove her right to be heard. The woman didn't reply. She turned and walked briskly toward the galley. Vanessa leaned back, exhaling slowly. Her sons were wide-eyed again, but this time, the fear had shifted. They weren't scared for themselves. They were in awe of her. Hours later, as the plane began its descent, Vanessa felt the hum of justice gathering. Her laptop sat open, her notes saved, her determination steady. When the wheels touched down, cabin lights flickered back to full brightness, and the passengers stirred awake. The senior flight attendant made one last pass through first class, avoiding Vanessa's eyes but performing her farewell routine for everyone else. "Thank you for flying with us," she said cheerfully. When she reached Vanessa's row, her voice faltered slightly. "Have a pleasant evening, ma'am." Vanessa looked up, her gaze calm, cutting. "I will," she said softly, "but you won't." The attendant blinked, uncertain, then moved on. Outside, as they walked through the jet bridge, Vanessa felt her sons close behind her. still in their neat jackets, still quiet, but changed somehow. She had always told them that dignity wasn't given. It was claimed. And now they had seen her claim it. Right there in the thin air where masks of politeness tried to suffocate truth. She knew what she had to do next, and it wouldn't be quiet. Because this wasn't going to end with one report or one apology. This time, the story would go public. And when it did, it wouldn't just be about her or her sons. It would be about every black traveler who'd ever been told, politely, subtly, that their comfort was negotiable. Vanessa Hart was about to shatter that illusion. And when she did, the entire airline would feel it. The next morning, the world began to tremble, quietly, then violently. It started with a post. Vanessa Hart didn't just write complaints. She built cases. Her statement was surgical, stripped of emotion, fortified with fact. She recounted the incident in detail. The date, the flight number, the name she had taken down, and, most importantly, the subtle yet unmistakable bias that underpinned it all. No embellishment, no vengeance, just truth, written with the precision of a woman who had nothing to prove, but everything to expose. And then she hit post. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. The headline began taking shape across social feeds. CEO claims airline discriminated against her children in first class, forces 3 black boys to share one meal. By noon, it was trending. Screens lit up across boardrooms, living rooms, newsrooms. And somewhere inside the airline's headquarters, a glass fortress overlooking a skyline of privilege, the crisis team convened, their voices tense, their eyes darting over the name they had underestimated. Vanessa Hart, a name they knew, a name they feared. Because Vanessa wasn't just any passenger. She was a CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country, a public figure whose reputation carried weight, whose words turned heads, whose influence could dismantle reputations. And this time, she wasn't talking about business. She was talking about racism, quiet, institutional, dressed in uniforms and manners. Inside her penthouse that afternoon, Vanessa watched the numbers climb, the shares, the comments, the outrage. But she wasn't celebrating. Her son sat beside her on the couch, still in disbelief at the reaction. Joshua leaned against her shoulder, scrolling through messages of support. Jaden frowned at the hateful ones. Jordan, always the gentlest, asked if they'd done something bad by speaking up. She turned to him, brushing a hand over his cheek. No, baby, we did something brave. Outside, the world was split, as it always was, half applauding her courage, half accusing her of exaggeration, of playing the race card, of making it about color. Vanessa had seen this dance before. She'd watched it play out in the comment sections of 1,000 injustices. But this time, the stakes were personal. Because her sons were reading those words. They were watching in real time as strangers dissected their pain like it was an academic debate. She closed the laptop and took a deep breath. Enough screens for today, she said softly. But the battle had already moved beyond her control. By the next morning, major networks had picked up the story. Images of her sons, the Triplet boys forced to share one first-class meal, appeared in headlines, on podcasts, and morning talk shows. Some framed it as a human interest story, others as a debate. But the image that broke the dam wasn't from her. It was from a passenger who had filmed the exchange. A shaky, mid-flight clip, no longer than 40 seconds, but enough. In it, Vanessa sat composed, her tone firm but calm. The flight attendant's expression was unmistakable, irritated, dismissive, impatient. The camera had captured everything. The raised hand, the subtle condescension, the collective discomfort of the other passengers. And when the attendant muttered, "Please stop making a scene," the world stopped pretending it was just a misunderstanding. The clip went viral within hours. Millions watched. Millions judged. At the airline's headquarters, the CEO, a man whose polished empathy was as synthetic as his rehearsed apologies, sat in silence as the clip played on repeat in the crisis room. "This isn't just a customer complaint," one executive said nervously. "This is PR combustion." Another chimed in. "We need to release a statement. Deny intent, express regret, promise investigation. Too late, said the CEO, eyes fixed on the screen. She's controlling the narrative, and she's better at it than we are. He was right, because Vanessa hadn't ranted. She hadn't accused blindly. She presented facts calmly, eloquently, powerfully, and the world listened. Back at home, Vanessa sat by her window as dawn broke, the skyline bathed in pale light. Her phone vibrated endlessly. Reporters, activists, old friends. Her inbox flooded with requests for interviews, partnerships, donations. She ignored them all. This wasn't about building a brand. It was about drawing a line. For years, she'd walked the tightrope between respectability and rebellion, the unspoken rule that successful black professionals must not appear angry, must not disrupt, must not make white comfort uneasy. But something had shifted inside her. She was done managing white fragility at the expense of her own truth. By the end of that week, the airline had released its statement, a polished paragraph of corporate regret. We are aware of the recent incident involving one of our flight attendants and a valued passenger. We take all claims of discrimination seriously and are conducting a thorough internal review. No names, no admission of fault, no apology to the children. The internet saw through it instantly. Comments flooded in. Thorough review equals nothing will happen. Just fire her. Racism is never a misunderstanding. The airline's stock dropped 3% that day. Their social channels went silent. And then, as if to pour gasoline on the fire, an anonymous employee leaked an internal email. It was written by the same flight attendant. And it read, "I was just following protocol. Those kids were clearly not supposed to be in first class. I didn't want to cause a scene, but their mother was confrontational from the start." Those words, "not supposed to be in first class," were the match that lit the inferno. By evening, protests were forming outside the airline's headquarters. Hashtags flooded timelines. Hashtag not supposed to be here. Hashtag fly while black. Hashtag share no meal. And Vanessa, she didn't need to say another word. The world was speaking for her. Days later, the airline called. They wanted to meet. The call came through her assistant, who hesitated before passing the phone. "They say it's about reconciliation," she said. "They want to apologize personally." Vanessa's lips curved slightly. "Reconciliation," she repeated. "They always use that word when they're afraid." Still, she agreed. Not for diplomacy, but for accountability. The meeting was held in a glass conference room high above the city, the kind of sterile, expensive space where truth was usually buried under PR scripts and coffee cups. Vanessa arrived in silence, wearing navy blue, not to impress, but to signify authority. Her sons didn't come. They'd been through enough. Across the table sat the airline's leadership team, the CEO, the head of communications, the HR director, and at the far end, the flight attendant herself. Her posture was small now, her face pale, the arrogance gone. "Ms. Hart," began the CEO, "we want to extend our deepest apologies." But Vanessa held up a hand. "No," she said quietly. "You don't start with apologies. You start with acknowledgement." He blinked. I'm not sure I understand." "Yes, you do," she said. "You start by admitting that what happened wasn't an isolated mistake. It was part of a culture that makes people like me and my sons feel like intruders in spaces we've earned the right to be in." Silence. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. The flight attendant swallowed hard. "I didn't mean." Vanessa turned her gaze to her. Calm, direct. "You didn't mean to, I know. That's how racism survives, through people who don't mean to, but do it anyway." The woman's eyes filled with tears. Vanessa didn't flinch. "This isn't about your feelings," she continued. "It's about accountability." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside was a proposal. A complete plan, not for compensation, but for change. It outlined new diversity training, bias audits, child safety protocols, public transparency. "I'm not asking," Vanessa said. "I'm telling you. If you want your airline to survive this, this is how you begin." The CEO looked at her, part awe, part shame. part fear. And if we refuse? Vanessa met his eyes. Then I go public again. And next time, I won't just tell my story. I'll tell every story I've received since mine went viral. Every message from every black traveler who's ever been made to feel not supposed to be here. He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because he knew she'd already won. The next morning, headlines blazed across the world. Airline announces major overhaul following racial discrimination scandal. CEO Vanessa Hart forces industry-wide change after viral flight incident. But the part that mattered most wasn't the policy. It was the image that followed, a photo taken at the press conference. Vanessa standing tall at the podium, her sons beside her, dressed in matching suits this time. Behind them, the airline's executives watched silently as she spoke. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't perform victory. She simply said, "We are not asking for special treatment. We are demanding equal humanity." The room erupted in applause. That night, back home, Vanessa tucked her sons into bed. Joshua, always thoughtful, asked, "Mom, are you mad at that lady still?" Vanessa paused. "No," she said softly. "I'm not mad. I'm disappointed. In a system that taught her to see us as less." Jaden frowned. "Do you think she'll change?" "I think," Vanessa said, "she'll never forget." And Jordan, half asleep, whispered, "We didn't share this time, did we?" Vanessa smiled faintly. "No, baby," she said. "This time, the world shared our story instead." She turned off the lamp and stood by the window for a long moment. Outside, the city lights shimmered, a constellation of possibility. And somewhere deep inside her, the tension began to ease. Not because justice had been fully served, but because silence had finally been broken. The world had listened, and that was the beginning of change. The storm didn't end overnight. Storms never do. They just fade slowly, leaving the air heavy with the scent of what's been burned away. Weeks passed. The headlines cooled. The hashtags waned. But the echoes of what had happened lingered everywhere. The airline implemented Vanessa's proposal almost word for word, though publicly they framed it as collaborative effort toward inclusivity. She didn't correct them. She didn't need credit. She had what she came for. Change that couldn't be quietly undone. She declined every talk show offer, every conference invitation, every brand partnership request that followed. For once, she didn't want to explain herself to anyone. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was recovery. It was a quiet Sunday morning when she finally exhaled. The triplets were sprawled across the living room floor, constructing an elaborate Lego city. Jordan was negotiating property lines like a little urban planner. Jaden was building skyscrapers with relentless precision. Joshua, as always, had found the fun in chaos, adding dinosaurs and helicopters when no one had asked for them. Vanessa sat on the couch, a coffee mug warm in her hands, watching them with that soft ache that only mothers understand, pride laced with the haunting memory of how close things had come to breaking. On the TV, muted news footage showed an airline executive at a podium announcing new cultural competency programs. In the corner of the screen, the ticker scrolled. Vanessa Hart declines to comment further. She smiled faintly. That was enough. A week later, a letter arrived. Not an email. A handwritten letter. The kind that carried weight because someone had taken time to write it. The envelope bore the airline's seal. Vanessa hesitated before opening it, expecting another round of corporate pleasantries. But the handwriting wasn't from an executive. It was slanted, careful, uncertain. Inside was a short note from the flight attendant. "Miss Hart, I know no apology can undo what happened. I've replayed that flight over and over, and I see everything now. The tone I used, the assumptions I made, the things I didn't question because they felt normal. They shouldn't have been normal. You and your boys deserved respect, not suspicion. I've started attending the bias training you pushed for. It's uncomfortable, and it should be. I wanted you to know that I'm not running from what I did. I'm learning from it. I'm truly sorry. Megan Price." Vanessa sat in silence for a long time, the letter resting in her lap. Forgiveness was complicated. Not a door you open once, but a hallway you walked through slowly. She didn't know if she could forgive yet, but she respected the courage it took to write those words. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, not to forget, but to remember that people could change when truth was forced into the light. By spring, her life began to feel normal again, or at least, her new version of normal. Her company had weathered the storm with grace. Her board stood firmly behind her, publicly affirming their support. Internally, though, Vanessa knew what it had cost her, not financially but emotionally. The exhaustion, the scrutiny, the ever-present tension of being a symbol when all she'd wanted was to be a mother protecting her children. At a board dinner one evening, one of her longtime investors, an older white man who fancied himself progressive, clinked his glass and said with a chuckle, "Vanessa, you've become quite the activist. Never thought I'd see you leading a social movement." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't lead a movement," she said. "I just refused to stay quiet." The table fell silent for a moment, and that was fine with her. That summer, she finally booked another trip with her boys, not to prove anything, but to reclaim something. They flew to Costa Rica, this time with a different airline. The boys were taller now, more confident, and just a bit wary as they boarded the plane. Vanessa noticed how they looked around, checking faces, uniforms, watching how people treated them. She wished they didn't have to, but she was proud they noticed. Awareness wasn't fear, it was armor. Halfway through the flight, the attendant, a young woman with bright eyes and warm energy, approached them with a tray of desserts. "These are compliments of the crew," she said with a smile, "for our young travelers up front." The boys grinned. Vanessa nodded politely. It was a small gesture, ordinary almost, but to her, it felt like sunlight breaking through after a long storm. That evening, on the hotel balcony overlooking the Pacific, she watched her sons chase each other on the sand. Their laughter carried on the wind, free, unburdened, alive. She thought about her mother, the one who had raised her to survive a world that often refused to see her. She imagined what her mother might say now. "You made them listen, baby. That's all I ever wanted, for the world to listen." Vanessa closed her eyes and let the ocean's rhythm steady her heartbeat. Back home, the changes she demanded had rippled outward. Other airlines began reviewing their policies. A few even invited Vanessa to consult, not for PR optics, but because they saw how her approach had worked. And though she declined most offers, she did agree to one, a partnership with a nonprofit that trained airline staff in racial empathy and cross-cultural awareness. She didn't want to make speeches. She wanted to build systems. She called it Project Skybridge because bridges, unlike walls, required maintenance, understanding, and shared weight. Within a year, her program was being implemented in 5 major airlines. Her sons watched proudly as she stood before a class of new flight attendants one afternoon, teaching them not from a corporate manual, but from lived experience. She told them, "You'll meet people who challenge your comfort. That's good. That's how you grow. When you're at 30,000 feet, every passenger is your equal, because the air doesn't care what color anyone is." The room was quiet, then filled with applause. And in that moment, Vanessa realized her fight had become something bigger than her pain. It had become purpose. Months later, a documentary filmmaker reached out. He wanted to create a short film titled First Class Humanity, not just about the incident, but about how one woman turned confrontation into reform. Vanessa hesitated. She didn't want to relive the pain. But the filmmaker said something that lingered. People see the viral moment. They don't see the healing that follows. Let's show that. She agreed. The documentary premiered quietly at a small film festival. It didn't win awards, but it moved people. Parents wrote her letters. Flight attendants reached out to thank her. One message, from a young black pilot in training, said, "Because of you, I applied. Because you reminded me I belong up there." Vanessa read it 3 times, tears warming her eyes. That was her reward. On the anniversary of the incident, 1 year to the day, Vanessa and her boys took another flight. Same route, same destination. But this time, something was different. When they boarded, the pilot himself came out to greet them. He smiled and said, "Ms. Hart, We're honored to have you and your sons aboard today. Your story changed how we fly." Vanessa blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity. "Thank you," she said softly. As they took their seats, Jordan whispered, "Mom, do you think everyone knows who we are?" She chuckled. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter. What matters is they see you now, really see you." The flight took off, smooth and quiet. Somewhere above the clouds, Jaden leaned toward the window, gazing at the horizon. "It's kind of funny," he said. "We started all this just trying to get lunch." Vanessa laughed, a deep, full laugh that she hadn't felt in months. "Yeah," she said, "and now look at us, feeding change instead." That night, when they landed home, Vanessa opened her journal. She didn't write often anymore, but tonight felt worth capturing. Her pen moved slowly, deliberately. "A year ago, I thought justice would look like punishment. But real justice looks like growth, the kind that ripples out and changes how people treat each other, even when no one's watching. I wanted the world to see what they did to my sons. Instead, they saw my sons are brilliant, kind, deserving. And maybe that's what healing really means, not erasing the pain, but transforming it into something useful." She closed the journal, set it on her nightstand, and glanced at the photo framed beside it, the one from the press conference. Her and the boys, standing strong, unbroken. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful victories don't roar. They whisper. They whisper in changed hearts, reformed systems, and children who grow up knowing they are worthy of the world. The next morning, sunlight spilled across her room. Her phone buzzed with a message from the flight attendant, Megan. "Just finished my first year mentoring new hires. I tell your story in every class. I hope you and the boys are doing well." Vanessa smiled and typed back, "We're doing just fine, Megan. Keep building that bridge." She set her phone aside and looked out the window. The sky was wide and endless, just like the work ahead, just like the possibility of what people could become when they finally learned to see one another clearly. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was bracing against the world. She felt like she was flying through it. The world moved differently after that day, or perhaps it only appeared to, because those who had witnessed it could no longer see it the same way. What began as a single act of cruelty aboard a plane had spread far beyond the fuselage, unraveling through the veins of an industry, a city, a nation, forcing people to look in the mirror and ask questions they had avoided for far too long. For weeks, the video replayed across screens, dissected by pundits and strangers, blurred faces and blurred morality. The world loved spectacle more than truth, but this was not something that could be dismissed as an isolated event. It had weight. It had gravity. It was the sound of centuries colliding with the present. The Triplet boys, once quiet, polite, and invisible to a world that preferred them unseen, had become unwilling symbols of something bigger than themselves. And their mother, Camille, had become a name whispered in admiration and discomfort alike. To some, she was a reminder of what grace under fire truly meant. To others, she was a mirror reflecting how easy it was to stay silent when dignity was being stripped from someone else. She didn't want fame. She didn't want revenge. All she had ever wanted was for her sons to be allowed to exist, to breathe, to grow, to learn without being crushed beneath the weight of someone else's fear. Yet after that day, their faces became a story told in every corner of the internet, not because they sought attention, but because truth, when finally seen, refuses to be buried again. In the days that followed the incident, the airline scrambled to contain the damage. Their press statements were polished, sterile, dripping with phrases like values of inclusion and commitment to sensitivity training. But behind the words was panic, not just for their reputation, but for the exposure of what had long been ignored in their corridors and conference rooms. Racism had always lived in policies, in tone, in decisions made behind closed doors. It wasn't new. It was just finally caught in 4K. Camille didn't release statements. She didn't go on interviews. Her silence was its own kind of rebellion, the refusal to let trauma become performance. Instead, she focused on her sons, who were still learning to process what had happened. Children remember not only what is said to them, but what is said around them. They had heard the flight attendant's voice tremble with superiority. They had seen passengers avert their eyes. They had felt the isolation of knowing no one would have intervened had their mother not been who she was. For days, they asked questions that cut deeper than any press headline. Why did she think we didn't deserve our meal? Would she have done that if we were white? Why did no one stop her sooner? Camille didn't have all the answers, but she had truth, and she gave it to them raw, not wrapped in comforting lies. She told them that people carry pain like inheritance, and sometimes they project that pain onto others, that ignorance can be louder than reason, and that their worth could never be defined by someone who refused to see it. She reminded them of something their late grandmother used to say. Dignity isn't given. It's held, even when they try to take it from you. Meanwhile, as the story gained momentum, voices from all sides emerged. Some defended the flight attendant, painting her as stressed, overworked, misunderstood. Others weaponized the incident, using it as proof of the racism still embedded in modern institutions. Amidst the noise, something powerful began to shift. People felt this story. It wasn't just another headline to scroll past. It lingered. It made people look at the systems they were part of, the jobs they worked in, the silence they kept, the assumptions they'd never questioned. Airlines across the country were forced to confront their own biases, their training methods, their hiring practices. Change was slow, as it always is, but it was movement, and movement, even if small, was resistance to stagnation. Behind the scenes, Camille continued her work quietly. She began speaking privately to employees, executives, and training consultants, not out of bitterness, but out of a belief that ignorance must be met with education, not vengeance. She became an unintentional reformer, a reluctant voice for change. She wasn't trying to save the airline. She was trying to save the next black child from ever having to learn the same lesson her sons did at 10 years old. That even in first class, some people will still see you as less. Months later, when the airline's internal culture had begun to evolve, Camille received a letter. It was handwritten, a rarity in an age of cold emails. It came from a woman who had been on the flight that day, sitting 2 rows behind her sons. She wrote that she hadn't spoken up out of fear, not of harm, but of judgment, that she had replayed that moment every night since, haunted by her silence. She ended her letter with words that would stay with Camille forever. Your strength exposed my cowardice, and somehow, that saved me. Camille read it quietly, her fingers trembling not from anger, but from understanding. Change doesn't begin with mass protests or policy memos. It begins with one person admitting they were wrong and choosing to be better tomorrow. That was enough for her. The boys grew from that day, not scarred but sharpened, not defined by what was done to them, but by how they chose to rise above it. They learned that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. They learned that grace can be power when wielded with purpose. And though the world would still try to test them, they carried the memory of that flight not as a wound, but as a reminder of who they came from. Their mother, calm, composed, and unyielding, had stood against a system built to shame her, and she hadn't flinched. She had turned humiliation into transformation, and in doing so, became the story the world needed to hear. In the end, the airline didn't collapse, but it did transform. Its CEO quietly restructured leadership, implemented zero-tolerance policies, and created outreach programs led by Camille herself. Her sons were invited to speak at youth panels about equality, not as victims, but as voices of hope. And yet, even as redemption took root, Camille never forgot the stillness of that cabin, the suffocating silence when no one spoke, the way her son's eyes had glistened with confusion and pain. That silence, she realized, was the true villain, not the woman's cruelty, but the crowd's compliance. It's the silence that keeps injustice alive. It's the silence that teaches children which lives matter most. It's the silence that history depends on, because if enough people stay quiet, the system never has to change. Now, when people watch that viral footage, they see outrage. But if they look closer, they'll see something else too. The moment a mother decided that her sons would never inherit the silence of those around them. And maybe that's what the world needs to learn, that speaking up is not an act of rebellion. It's an act of humanity. As the months turned to years, the story faded from headlines, replaced by the next outrage, the next trending injustice. But for those who were on that plane, and for millions who saw what happened, the lesson remained. That sometimes, racism doesn't wear a hood. It wears a uniform. It smiles as it serves coffee, apologizes as it humiliates you, and hides behind policies written to protect the powerful. And sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is stay calm, stand tall, and let the truth speak for itself. Because truth, when spoken with dignity, becomes unstoppable. And so, as the world keeps spinning, and stories like this keep echoing through generations, let this one be remembered not just for its pain, but for its power. Remember Camille's quiet strength. Remember her son's resilience. Remember that even in a cabin full of silence, one mother's courage shattered an entire airline, not with rage, but with resolve. And if this story reached you, if it made you pause, feel, or reflect, then let that be your small act of resistance. Don't let it fade into the endless scroll of forgettable noise. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it forward. Because awareness is the first flight toward change. And if you believe in stories that make us feel, think, and see again, then please subscribe. Not for me, not for clicks, but to keep this conversation alive. To stand together, one story at a time, until silence no longer wins.